with deeds and history, and I worked as a surveyor for a few years and spent a lot of time in the registry. And so part of my interest was sparked by that. And I thought I'd talk tonight about William Phillips, who was here in Bedford, and his legacy, who were the proprietors who inherited his land, and they were the heirs of Bridget Phillips, is what they called them. I don't know, is anybody familiar with the story? Anyway, people did come to the New World for many reasons, for political or religious reasons, but there always had to be an economic motive behind it. Richard Vines, who was down here at Winter Harbor, he showed up working probably for Gorges, and he had a fur trading partner named John Oldham and was granted a patent in Saco by the Plymouth Council in 1630. They agreed to settle 50 settlers, and there were a bunch of caveats they had to fill. And that tract of land was 4 miles on the sea and it extended 8 miles up into the country. Vines dabbled in some fishing, he did some lumbering, cattle raising, he explored the silver mines, but none of it met his expectations, and so he thought he would cash out and go to Barbados, which was the new hotspot, where they were raising sugarcane and making sugar. So in 1645, he owned it for 15 years, he sold his patent to Robert Childs, and then he moved to Barbados, where there were a lot of people going there. The Leader brothers, who ran the Saugus Iron Works and the great sawmills down on the Great Works, the heavy industry of the day, they all went down to Barbados. There was a big group of them. He renewed his practice of medicine because of a medical doctor, and he died in 1851. The new owner of the Saco patent was Robert Childs, and he had a lot of New World investments, a lot of it in conjunction with a Dutchman named John Becks. And they owned the biggest part of the Saugus Iron Works, which was the real heavy industry of the day. Running the ironworks proved to be not very successful, and it was heavily in debt. And one of the men that they were indebted to was a man named Samuel Armitage of Lynn, who wanted his money back from Becks and the ironworks. And so he filed a flurry of lawsuits. It all kind of came to nothing. And then finally he won a judgment in court that said that the ironworks had to pay him his debt. Well, there was no money at the ironworks. But he knew that Becks and Childs owned this fishing village up here in Winter Harbor. So he showed up and tried to extort his debt from the fishermen in Winter Harbor, who resisted him. And the quote was, Armitage, moreover, behaved with undue violence and asserting his pretended right, threatened to clear the land by fire and thus lay waste the improvement made upon it, unless his claims were admitted. The claimant was a man of low standing and of embarrassed circumstances. So, when you come to, you think about the situation there. In Maine, there's no law, there's no courts, there's no nothing, and you've got this nut threatening to burn you out unless you pay them off. And Childs and Becks, they were probably in Barbados by then, but enter William Phillips, who turned out to be the white knight for the Saco plantation. Childs was more than glad to sell him this the Saco plantation here, it's called Saco. But Winter Harbor and everything else, sold them the whole shooting match for 90 pounds. And Phillips said, everybody calm down, I'm going to honor all the deeds, I'm going to work with you here, I'm going to calm everything down, and Armitage went away. I don't know exactly what happened to him. Phillips had as his third wife a woman named Bridget Hutchinson Sanford, whose husband had been the governor of Rhode Island. And she moved up here with him in 1661. He purchased another sawmill while he was here. He had another sawmill built, and he was well on his way to profiting from his main adventure. After he had secured the Beck's purchase, he set about expanding his empire by obtaining deeds from Native Americans. In 1660, he secured a deed for the land on the west bank of the Saco above Salmon Falls from an Indian named Hobinuit, alias John Ruckamock, and that comprises the present towns of Dayton and Hollis. And then he purchased the interior York County from Llewellyn, which comprises the current towns of Sanford and Alfred. I'm using kind of broad strokes just to kind of get you oriented in the size of these purchases. Then he got a deed from Mohegan, and that expanded him all the way to the Kennebunk River on the coast. So he enlarged his holdings significantly, all from Indian deeds.
You're saying that he owned everything from here to the Kennebec River?
No, Kennebunk River.
Oh, Kennebunk, sorry.
Kennebunk, yeah. They would later describe their land as starting at the fishing islands in Cape Porpoise, all the way along the coast to Winter Harbor, then up the river past Salmon Falls, and then all the way up the Saco to the New Hampshire border, 4 miles in from so it's a huge swath of land. Basically northern, central, and eastern York County. It's what he could claim through Indian deeds.
Could you just clarify the Indian deeds? I'm kind of curious. How did they come to own these parcels?
You know, academics have made a living trying to figure out what the Indians sold, or what they thought they sold, or who had the right to sell it. Land ownership didn't have the same, the Native Americans did not think of it the same way.
Right.
There was no concept of exclusive use, where this is mine and you can never come here. It was all a shared landscape. The only thing that was of value were the things that were on it, like the game, the fishing spots. They did get possessive about hunting gardens. There were a lot down on the mouth of the Saco before the pandemic. But, so we really don't know what they thought they were selling, and when you see the deeds described as 4 miles by 4 miles, what did that mean to a Native American? I mean, they had no idea what an English mile was. You know, a lot of them didn't even reference physical landmarks, which is what Native Americans would have been familiar with. And there was really no limit to it. Some of the deeds just said, on the east side of the Saco, as far as my land goes. Now, you hand that description to a surveyor, and he's going to have a real hard time figuring what was actually sold and what it was purchased for. He purchased more land on the eastern bank of the Saco from a native named Captain Sandy. which is today's Hollis and part of Leamington. Captain Sandy will show up again in this talk as selling more land to other men, the same land. And he had references in Phillips's deeds to deeds from Squantos, Tobacco Man, and others that he just didn't even bother registering or recording. So there are other deeds out there that who knows what the description is, but it really didn't matter.
Bruce, where did they register these deeds? In Boston or?
No, the Maine always had its own. We had a registry of deeds. It was all down in York, usually York and Kerry. I think they would swap it back and forth. But you can go to the registry and find these deeds. They're
And you've done that, right? You've done it?
Yeah. Like I say, who knows what they really conveyed or what they thought they were conveying. Upon arrival in Maine, William Phillips professed loyalty to Massachusetts and took an oath of submission. He wanted Massachusetts to approve of his Indian purchases, which they did, because at that time the Puritans were on the descendancy because the king was put back on the throne, and since the Puritans had killed the English king, they didn't quite know where their charter stood. They didn't want to go back to England and hash it out again. So Massachusetts was taking Indian deeds as face value. And Phillips wanted to make sure that he would have his purchases verified. And things were going pretty well until about 1665, when the Royal Commissioners showed up and appointed him Justice of the Peace. Now his Vines purchase was a royal charter, and so the basis of all his land went back to that royal grant. So he would have been considered a royalist because that was the source of all his land. And he had no love for the Puritans anyway. And things started to go badly for him, and then finally they ordered his arrest in 1665 to arrest he and his wife for not attending church. But he was not a guy to be kind of quailed by that sort of thing, so he said, I'm going to go down to Boston and straighten this mess out. The place is lousy with Puritan administrators and Puritans running the courts. He went down to Boston and they threw him in jail. They wanted a 500-pound bond to assure his good behavior, and he said he wasn't going to pay it, and so they threw him in jail. He was in there for a week, had some time to think it over a little bit, and said, okay, I'm going to post the bond, and quickly fled back to Maine to put some distance between he and the Puritans in Massachusetts. Trying to cement his political security, he started selling land to powerful Bay Colony politicians and merchants to compensate for past political favors and future considerations. To the Massachusetts governor, he sold 3 square miles of land and 3 miles of river frontage for a 50-pound debt. And then he cemented political favor with powerful merchants such as Richard Hutchinson. He gave him 1,000 acres. Edward Ting, 1,500 acres. Richard Russell, 1,500 acres. And this is all land north of Biddeford, going up the river. It seemed Swan Pond Creek was kind of the break-off. All this land was north of Swan Pond Creek. And they measured the frontage in miles, 2-3 miles of river frontage. They, of course, thought that this was a great deal because they knew that eventually the land would become more valuable. Tensions with the Native Americans began to simmer around 1670 And it was higher in southern New England where Englishmen and natives lived in closer contact. And finally, in 1675, King Philip's War broke out. About mid-July, the conflict had reached Maine. The local tribe, led by a Native American named Squando, threw in with a bunch of refugees from the more southern war, and they decided to attack Phillips and his sawmills on the Saco. I'm sure you've all heard this. This was in 1675, 100 tribesmen attacked Phillips's garrison. They tried to crash in the door with a flaming cart of hay, but it got stuck in the mud, and when they jumped out to get the wheel out of the ditch, they met a galling fire, and eventually 21 natives were killed, and the rest retreated from the fight. Phillips was wounded in the garrison and sent a messenger to Winter Harbor for assistance, which wasn't coming. And so he was, back when they ran out of ammunition, they probably walked right through here to get down to Winter Harbor, where the war party hung around Saco for a few more days, burning farmhouses. They burned Phillips's garrison. They burned his sawmills, and they killed any stragglers they could find. He didn't linger long in Winter Harbor garrison, and by June of 1676, he was in Boston describing himself late of Saco. To generate more money from his holdings, which was decreasing in value all the time because it was full of Indians, hostile Indians, he began to sell the most accessible parts of his empire. That meant the seaside and riverfront property. A year after his departure from Maine, he conveyed a portion of his seaside holdings, relying on a deed from Muskegon. He sold to kinsmen 4 miles of oceanfront, extending from the Baxter River to the Kennebunk River, extending 4 miles inland, comprises what's today Kennebunk and Arundel, Kennebunkport. Having sold off everything on the rivers and everything on the shorefront, he decided his next plan was to make an inland township. And he was going to make a township 8 miles square, 8 miles from the ocean, beyond the Wells headline. But he was well aware that Llewellyn, the native that sold him the land, had also sold land to other Englishmen in the area, so he slid it as far west as he could. And what they were talking about was Sanford. He whipped up a list of his kids, stepchildren, business associates, and granted them each 1,000 acres in the paper township. The remainder of the land he retained to be sold when the settlement made it more valuable. And there was almost constant Indian wars. At King Philip's War, King William's War, 1688 to 1697, Queen Anne's War, 1702, 1714, Lovell's War, 1722, 1725. So it was almost constant fighting for the next 50 years or so. His planned township existed only on paper. It really wasn't worth anything because no one would go there, nobody would buy land there, nobody would have anything to do with it. It was crisscrossed by Indian groups heading toward the coast, and they had a garrison. They set up a garrison around 1740s. And they would run from Salmon Falls to Sanford to Berwick, and they would patrol what was an old Native American path, looking for tribal war parties crossing that path. So they were just kind of skipping across there. Nobody could live there permanently. William Phillips never lived to see his paper dream come to fruition. His will was dated 1682, and it was the deed was executed in 1683. He left his land to his wife Bridget Hutchinson Phillips and his sons William and Samuel. When Bridget died in 1698, the land went to her daughter Ethel Sanford and the stepsons. So that is where they get the heirs of Bridget Phillips. It all kind of came down from William Phillips to Bridget Phillips, and then it was dispersed. The title, everyone knew about it in the family, but it was basically worthless. Nobody would buy it from you. It was like an old watch. It didn't cost anybody anything to maintain. It was just something that was there with really no opportunity to sell it. They formed a proprietary. As the first generation was dying off, now as the second generation, and they knew they wanted to maintain an eye on the town. They wanted to make sure that if there was a way to profit from it, they would be ready. And so they formed a proprietary called the Heirs of Bridget Phillips, and they held sporadic meetings in Boston. Interest would peak during times of peace, and as soon as there was another war, they would put it on the back burner and not even think about it. It was largely a family affair until 1718, when the heirs of Samuel Phillips sold their interest in the Saco Mill, 800 acres in Cape Porpoise, the islands in Saco Bay, and the land in Winter Harbor, basically all of Samuel Phillips's land, to 3 Boston merchants, Edward Bromfield, Thomas Salter, and Samuel Adams, who was the father of the revolutionary Samuel Adams. Then there was more. Phillips land came on the market, and Bromfield, Salter, and Adams teamed up with Sir William Pepperell and bought that and split that up among themselves. So at the end of Lovell's War, which was about 1729, interest started to pick up in the frontier land. They thought maybe that was the last war. They couldn't see the future. And so they were starting to think about maybe we can divide some of this land, and the most aggressive people in the group were Adams, Salter, and others who had actually paid for this land. The other people were just inherited. It hadn't cost them anything, but these other merchants, these young rising merchants, wanted to make the money back. And so they were the most aggressive in the proprietary, trying to steer them toward dividing the land up and lotting it out. In 1736, in a meeting of the Phillipstown proprietors were joined by 2 rising stars in the Bay Colony. These were superstars in the social and economic circle. Thomas Hutchinson Jr. and Andrew Oliver. Now, both of these guys were, Thomas Hutchinson Jr. was to become the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts just prior to the Revolution. His brother-in-law was Andrew Oliver, and he was in charge of implementing the Stamp Act. Later on, they became much despised people. They had married sisters who were the granddaughters of Peleg Sanford, who had inherited a large portion of the original William Phillips estate.
What was his first name again?
Peleg, P-E-L-E-G. Peleg. Yeah, you probably hear about it in school. These guys were wealthy, they were young, they were aggressive, and they were going to take over the family financial empire that they were due to inherit. They were very wealthy guys. They were astute businessmen, and they plunged into an audit of the proprietorships, records, and perused minutes. Proprietors' interest flagged again in King George's War and the French and Indian War, but when Canada was ceded to England in the Treaty of Paris of 1763, Native Americans lost their support system to continue on the war. So the Native American raids stopped. And all of a sudden, all these people who had been cooped up along the shore, the only place you could live was along the coast. They had been there for 4 generations. They had divided their land so that they couldn't divide it again and have a viable farm. And people were dying to get into the backcountry. So people in my town of Alfred, the first people showed up in 1763, which is the year of the peace. I mean, they were people flooded into the backcountry. The list of people attending the proprietors' meetings in the 1760s reveals the political extremes that were in Massachusetts at that time. There was the Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson and his brother-in-law Andrew Oliver. One was the King's mouthpiece in the colony, and the other responsible for the Stamp Act. Loyalist Nathaniel Sparhawk attended meetings as an heir of Sir William Phillips. Probably the most rabid loyalist was a man named Samuel Waterhouse, whose wife had inherited some of the Phillips land. He was a hard drinker, and he had a day job, a cushy day job as a secretary in the Customs House, and he used to write doggerel newspaper verse insulting the Boston Revolutionary leaders. So he was not a favorite guy. Across the table at the proprietors' meetings was Sam Adams, the well-known revolutionary firebrand and leader of the Boston mob. Dr. Joseph Warren, his wife had inherited some of the land, and he would die on Bunker Hill. Also, people who just showed up at the meetings. Some of them had no interest in the proprietors, but you can see the names. John Hancock showed up at some meetings. Benjamin Eddies, who was the printer of the Boston Newsletter, which was the radical newspaper of the day. But the most subversive attendee was probably John Avery Jr., and he was a charter member of the Loyal Nine, which is like the SDS of the day. And the Loyal Nine orchestrated the Boston mob. They founded the Sons of Liberty. They were most radical of the most radical. And he was the secretary for this group, for this proprietorship, and he was at every meeting. So he knew what was going on. And you think about these guys, during the day, Sam Adams is whipping up the mob to thwart everything that Hutchinson was trying to do as the lieutenant governor. And then at night, they get together in a tavern and say, well, how can we make money together? Well, they couldn't. They couldn't agree on anything. They couldn't. The color of the walls would have done enough. They despised each other. They had to change their meeting place, actually, from the British Coffee House, which was a hangout for Tories and British officers, to the more neutral Vernon Head Tavern. They didn't even dare to go to the same places. And besides the political divisions, there was a real animosity between the Hutchinsons and the Adams family. Samuel Adams came up, he was was part of a scheme that they called the land bank. And the idea was that if you had a bunch of land, and a lot of people had a lot of land, you could take it to this land bank, and they would basically give you a mortgage, and you could use that money to invest in whatever else you wanted. It was a way to liberate cash, to cash in on some of this stuff. And he wanted to do that with his Phillips heirs land. But guys like Hutchinson and Oliver, who held a lot of debt from the colonists, they liked the tight money situation. They knew that if you could trade land for money, then this was wildly inflationary. You were going to get paid back with cheap dollars, and they did everything they could. And they were in a position politically to squash the land bank. And it took a few years, and they did squash the land bank. They had it declared illegal. Actually, they made Samuel Adams Sr. personally responsible for the debt of the land bank, and there was a lot of debt. And it ruined the Adams family financially. Sam Adams Jr., the revolutionary, saw his father, basically impoverished. I don't know if he did any time in debtor's prison, but the family fortune was ruined. Sam was kind of a slacker anyway, and he thought he was going to live large on Dad's money, and it didn't work out for him. So he held, Sam Adams Jr. held the Hutchinsons personally responsible for his family's ruin, and he never forgot it. And every opportunity he got to take a jab at it, he took it. Phillipstown, which was William Phillips' paper town of Sanford, was the only thing that they managed to accomplish. In 1768, they had Sanford as incorporated. They incorporated it, they sent the paperwork in as Phillipstown, but when it got to the Massachusetts legislature, someone, they said the governor, but probably not, said, no, Phillipstown, no, scratch. And they wrote in Sanford for Key Salmon, because that's where all the land came from. So that was Hutchinson's final jab at him. Sanford was the only town incorporated between 1767 and 1771. The war, of course, threw everything into turmoil. There were riots led against Hutchinson and Oliver. Nothing was getting done. The courts were closed down. Nothing was going on. And then the Hutchinson-Oliver clan and the Pepperells and Sam Waterhouse were declared loyalists in Massachusetts and left. The Hutchinsons and Olivers went to England, and the Pepperells. Sam Waterhouse, he went to Nova Scotia. I don't know where he ended up. And in 1777, Massachusetts confiscated all the land of loyalists. They said it goes back to the state now. We're seizing their land. And that included the interior of York County that was owned by the Hutchinsons. Settlers who started streaming into the land coming back from the Revolution thought, this is state land now. This is open land that we can claim because this is our reward for fighting and winning the Revolution. We can settle here. So the place was lousy with squatters. There was people spread all over especially Alfred, Waterboro, that whole area, because they thought it was Hutchinson land that had been confiscated. After the war, they got the proprietorship back together and said, we've got to figure out what we got left. We've got to figure out what hasn't been incorporated as a town, because we can't claim that. We've got to figure out what the state took from the loyalists, whatever that was, and we have to figure out where we stand in relationship to the other proprietors in the areas who were claiming land also based on Indian deeds. Like I said, Phillips claimed all that land, but there were Indians out there who had sold multiple deeds to multiple parties. One of the claimants was the Small heirs. They were the descendants of Francis Small, who was an Indian trader. He had a camp upon the Ossipee River. He was the first white man who entered the soil, and he was selling goods to the Indians and expected to be paid back that winter in furs. Don't know what kind of a guy he was, but Captain Sandy, who was the local chief, who had sold some land to Phillips, and sold he came and said, members of my tribe intend to kill you tonight and burn down your trading post. And Small kind of laughed him off and said, yeah, sure. And then Sandy said, oh, okay, and he left. And Small started to have second thoughts about it, so he hid in the woods, and that night, sure enough, his trading post went up, and he hightailed it out of there, ran for his life. He got to Portland, and Captain Sandy followed him, the Native American that had warned him, and said, look, I know there were people in my tribe who did it. I'm going to make good on the debt, and I'll sell you some land. So he, what's interesting, that over at the registry, they would always show you this deed, and they sometimes called him Captain Sandy or Captain Sunday. It was the same Indian. He said he was of Ossipee at one point. He said on another deed he was from Berwick. So who knows where it's from. But this one has the compensation. The other deeds never say what the white man paid for the land. And so they said for 2 large Indian blankets, 2 gallons of rum, 2 pounds of powder, 4 pounds of musket balls, and 20 strings of Indian beads, and several other articles, I, Captain Sandy Selton, Francis Small of Kittery, he said, all the land between the Great and Little Ossipee rivers, and my land that extends from River Noachawannock, which is in South Berwick, and extends northerly and easterly to the Saco River, to have and hold to him, blah, blah, boy. So he sold him 20 miles square of land, all of interior and northern. He'd already sold it once to Phillips, but I guess it didn't matter.
You didn't sell him any gunpowder, though, did it?
No, it was, what was it? No, yes he did. 2 pounds of powder, 4 pounds of musket balls.
There you go.
And that was in 1668. Francis Small conveyed 1/2 of his new holdings to his partner, Major Nicholas Shapley, and the other half to his son, Samuel Small. So this was a transaction that went down in 1668, and the deed was lost for 100 years. It wasn't recorded in the registry until 1770, which is when interest in dividing up perhaps proprietors who wanted to make a claim on land had to come up with something. and they found this deed. Matter of fact, I think they recorded it twice. First time they said, well, that's the best of our recollection of what the deed said. And then later they said, oh, we found the real one, we'll record that one too. There was a lot of stuff going on. The first thing the small heirs had to do was separate what they owned from the Shapley heirs. And in 1771, the Shapley heirs were awarded present-day Parsonsfield, Shapley, Acton, and half of Limerick. The small heirs were awarded Newfield, Wilmington, Cornish, and the other half of Limerick. They hired, the Shapley heirs as their lawyer, hired James Sullivan, who was offered the half of Limerick if he would defend all claims against the Shapley heirs, and which he named because Limerick was the town in Ireland that his father came.
James Sullivan.
James Sullivan,
Yeah.
father, yeah.
And he was a fence jumper
Yeah.
when he came over.
Yeah. There was another claim, that was the Cox Hall proprietors, and they had 4 miles square that they sold to 3 Cape Corpus fishermen back in the 60s, and he quickly sold it to a man named Halleck and Simons, who distributed it to, I think it was like 43 of his friends and relatives down in Ipswich, Mass. The Cox Hall proprietors, it was a square of land, 4 miles by 4 miles, sat right on the northern boundary of Wells with a corner on the Mousam River, and comprised basically southern Alfred and southern Wyman. But nobody really knew where it was. I'm sure you couldn't ask the Native American, okay, take me 4 miles in that direction. 4 miles meant nothing. But they knew it was near the middle of what the Phillips still had. They produced, when the Loyalists, the Phillips Loyalists left for England, and the state started to try to claim that land, Cox Hall heirs started producing Native American deeds that expanded their holdings to 6 miles by 6 miles. I mean, these guys were like pufferfish, you know, and when they didn't feel any resistance, they just kind of swelled up to take in all the land around them. And when they knew that the Hutchinsons were not there to defend their claim, they said, we'll sell people anything they want. And they sold them deeds. They sold deeds to all comers. The wrangling between the proprietors, the Phillipses, the Shapley, Small, and Cox Hall heirs to determine what they each owned. It went on for decades. Lawyer James Sullivan, who was a historian and governor of Massachusetts, made his living studying land title, wrote in his main history, published in 1795, the grants under the European titles conveyed the same land to several grantees, and the Indian deeds did the same. All these principles and circumstances combined to fill the country with lawsuits and controversies to the great distress and impoverishment of the inhabitants. Nor is the calamity yet over, and it may be added, unless some measure is taken by the legislator with an end to the litigation, the district will groan under the injury for a long time to come. And groan it did. Finally, there was a young lawyer who probably read those words. He was going to Brown, and his name was John Holmes. He read those words about the confused title, the overlapping claims in York County, and to a clever lawyer, that's like blood in the water. You know that you can make a dime there if you can hook up with somebody making a claim. So seeing it as an opportunity, John Holmes fresh from graduation and a little practical experience under his belt, went to Alfred, Maine, which was ground zero for the controversial land title. He cracked open books at the registry and studied the situation, reading the proprietor's records, and he figured it out. He contended that at Governor Hutchinson's death, the land went to his sons, who claimed half of the Hutchinson Oliver land, because it came from their mother. The mother had inherited the land, who was the Sanford. Hutchinson, as the husband, could control the land, but only really had a life estate. But since he didn't own it after he died, they said, the state can't seize it from you. And that was his theory. He said it can't be taken by the state. Couldn't claim it as loyalist land. They said that the Hutchinson claims stood, and he found that the Hutchinsons, in effect, still own what is Alfred Village and north up into Shaker Hill, if you're familiar with that area. It still belonged to the Hutchinsons. So, when Alfred was named the Shire Town in 1803, and the county buildings were due to be built, John Holmes determined the whole Alfred area, already sold by the Coxhall proprietors, was actually belonged to the Phillips heirs, specifically the Hutchinson Oliver clans, who were cooling their heels in England. Before the log jail and the courthouse could be built, York County would have to pay up, and the Hutchinson agents they would deal with in America was John Holmes. So he forced York County to pay for the land and then send it off to the descendants now of the loyalists who were living in England, who'd been thrown out of the country, basically. And then the next thing John Holmes did was he began knocking on the doors of his Alfreds and neighbors, informing them that the Coxhall land they had purchased was bad, but he would sell them Hutchinson deeds. So they would essentially pay for their farms twice. He was charging low money. He said, okay, I'm going to be fair about this. I'm going to only charge you what the land was worth before any improvements were made. So it really wasn't a lot of money. And I've gone through most of his conveyances, and it was not consistent, person to person. I think he used it as a way to jab his political rivals, and if somebody was too poor to pay it, he just wouldn't approach him. Not like the guy was Robin Hood or anything, but I think he realized that he didn't have to make an enemy of everybody in town. So until 1818 or so, he was collecting money from all his neighbors and shipping it off to the loyalists still in England, after taking his fees, of course. Extorted money from his neighbors. Remarkably, his neighbors didn't hold it against him. They thought someone that clever should be working for us, and they elected him to the Massachusetts legislature. So he went down to Boston representing them, and then he was elected to the Massachusetts House seat in Washington, D.C., where he orchestrated and led the fight to make Maine a state and separate from Massachusetts. He wrote the separation articles and helped write the Maine Constitution, and drove the vote to make Maine a state in the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Upon statehood, he immediately quit his Massachusetts seat and was elected Maine's first senator. a seat he held into the 1830s when he came back to Alfred and built his mansion, which sits, I don't know if you know where, it's the Oak Street Bistro now. Next to that is the Wolf and Wood bookstore, and then right beside that, it's kind of a southern looking thing that kind of sits back in the bushes. It's known locally as the bow and arrow house because the balusters have bows and arrows pointing down at the ground. All his career accomplishments were springboarded from untangling 140-year-old Indian deeds and musty proprietors' records, which was the legacy of William Phillips.